At the end of the First World War, the victorious Allies had severely punished Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had forced the Germans to give up huge areas of national land and all overseas colonies, reduced armed forces to practically nothing, and pay a vast sum of money called reparations to France, Britain, and Belgium. Harsh terms of peace fueled the smoldering embers of the First World War and burst into the flames that became the Second World War. The year is 1932. It's an election year. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, promises to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, build up the armed forces, provide jobs for everybody, and reunite the fatherland. Hitler's simplest but most sinister idea involves convincing the Germans that the Jews are to blame for all of Germany's problems. Brown-shirted Nazi thugs called stormtroopers beat up Jews in the streets and destroy their property. As Hitler tightens his grip on Germany, other European nations are also moving towards totalitarian or fascist states. Fascism is a system of government that glorifies the state and a single all-powerful ruler. Any opposing views are outlawed.
You had a leader who was above reproach, whom you didn't vote in and out of office, who took office and stayed there forever. So individual rights, individual liberties are suppressed under fascist rule. And the idea is that the most important thing for an individual is to give his life for the state.
Fascism became popular in European nations that were suffering economic depression after World War I. In Italy, fascist Benito Mussolini wanted to build a new Roman Empire. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin is creating a military superpower and forcing the nation to obey his commands. In the 1930s, the fascists and communists swarmed across Europe. General Francisco Franco, with Hitler's and Mussolini's help, took over Spain by way of a bloody civil war. Hitler's armies marched into Austria and Czechoslovakia. Hitler and Stalin signed a treaty of friendship, then carved up Poland. German dive bombers, sirens screaming, swept over Poland in advance of fast-moving panzer tanks in a blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Next, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. A month later, panzers rolled through Holland and Belgium in an end run around the French fortifications. After France surrendered in June 1940, almost all of Western Europe was under Axis control. To pound the British into submission, Hitler launched an all-out air war.
The Nazis had begun their shattering blitz on Britain.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began.
As the Battle of Britain raged overhead, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill rallied the British people on the radio, just as Roosevelt had done for Americans during the Great Depression with his fireside chats. The British people, Churchill said, faced a time of blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, German submarines in wolf packs threatened to strangle Great Britain by cutting it off from the rest of the world. With France defeated and British forces tied up in North Africa, Hitler stunned the world once again. On June 22, 1941, more than 100 German divisions poured into the Soviet Union and quickly penetrated all the way to Stalingrad. The Soviet Union turned to the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was quick to recognize the implications of dictators seizing power in Europe and Asia. He believed that if Britain fell and the Axis powers were victorious, freedom and democracy would be in danger everywhere. But many Americans didn't want anything to do with another war in Europe. In the 1930s, a majority of Americans believed that U.S. participation in World War I had been a mistake. Many believed that the country's involvement had been manipulated by big business. This popular belief gave rise to Senate hearings led by Senator Nye to investigate the role that businesses had played in the United States decision to enter World War I. The hearings found that U.S. businesses had not conspired to trick the country into entering the war in order to make more money. But the hearings did expose that more than 1/4 of the top 100 corporations were doing business with Nazi Germany. We do not inquire into the use of the products, one chemical industry official stated. We are interested in selling them. To prevent the United States from being drawn into another war in Europe, Congress passed a series of Neutrality Acts. Roosevelt thought this ostrich-like legislation was wrong. He wanted the United States to help Britain defeat the Nazis without being drawn into the war. After Italy invaded Ethiopia and Japan invaded China in 1937, he made a stirring call to embargo or quarantine such aggressors. But those who wanted to stay neutral, called isolationists, continued to fight to keep the United States out of the conflict. After Hitler's conquest of France in June of 1940, FDR had to figure out how to help Great Britain without breaking the neutrality laws. In September 1940, during his campaign for an unprecedented third term as president, Roosevelt authorized the transfer of 50 old American destroyers to the British in exchange for a few Atlantic naval bases in the so-called Destroyers for Bases deal. Re-elected in 1940, FDR got around the law against aiding the Allies by lending rather than selling arms to Great Britain and convinced Congress to lay out $7 billion to cover the cost of his Lend-Lease program.
I ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations.
Not surprisingly, the German Führer was less than pleased. Shipping arms to the Allies on whatever terms put the United States in the same position that the country had been in 25 years earlier, as a neutral supplier on the eve of World War I. In a sense, history was repeating itself. German U-boats once again went on the attack, and the United States vessels once again became the targets. When a U-boat sunk the U.S. destroyer Reuben James off Iceland, the United States Neutrality went to the bottom with its crew. 2 weeks later, Congress voted to arm merchantmen, and the American people began to prepare themselves for another war.